Okay, folks, so welcome back. It's been a while. We've had minors and had a semester break, and one class I decided to cancel because I thought you would need to just some downtime after minors. So we have one class to make up, and my sense is the thing for me to do is actually not to assign an extra class in the semester, but perhaps assign a recording of something I'd done earlier for a different class, which will speak to the last section of this course, which is on reasoning with data. So I'll, let me just think about that a little bit and then get back to you. So as I was saying before I started recording, I screwed up a little bit in terms of what to assign you guys. I had assumed that Monday was a working day when it was in fact a holiday. So we're a little bit slower than we would otherwise have been. But today we wrap up this section of the course in our lectures, and then we start discussing the science part of the course for the next 3 weeks in the lectures next week. Of course, we've already done that, the science stuff, in the tutorials last week and this week. And again, for people coming on Friday tutorial, I really urge you to see the video clips that I put up on Piazza. I think you'll find them quite interesting and thought-provoking. When I find I'm often in a situation where I come to a tutorial of assigned reading, but nobody's done it, then we have to spend time in the tutorial for people to do the reading there, which is not a great use of our time. I prefer to spend more of that time actually in discussion. Okay, so with all of that said, last time, if you recall, we discussed this set of things that Hurley calls fallacies of relevance. You remember we talked about a whole bunch of them. That the key ones are the ones that I think come up the most in practical life. You are maybe the ad hominem fallacies, the different kinds of ad hominem fallacies, the straw man argument, and red herrings. And it's an interesting exercise to the extent that you're a witness to or involved in any kinds of debates or arguments on TV, on social media with your friends, to watch the extent to which these fallacies actually take place. The key point of this set of fallacies, the key take home is, in a way, to avoid being distracted or to notice when the subject is being changed or being led down another line of inquiries. The aim as a critical thinker is to avoid that happening, and one way of doing that is just to constantly ask your question: what's the conclusion, and are the premises of this argument that's being offered to us, do they provide any evidence one way or the other for that conclusion? You recall I ended that class, I think, with that famous clip of that journalist from the BBC. He's asking the same question again and again and again when the politician is constantly trying to change the subject or do whatever he can to avoid answering that question. So in a way, the intellectual self-defense aspect of the that set of fallacies is this kind of relentlessness about making sure that you have clarity as to what's being talked about. One thing that people say in the context of I don't know if people have seen that, like relationship counseling and things. If you and your partner or you and your parents have fights, and sometimes, in the course of fights, people change the subject, right? I'm having a fight with somebody. I say, look, I'm upset at you because you didn't do X that you said you would. And then they say, hey, I'm upset at you because you didn't do Y, which I said. The answer is not to suddenly switch from X to Y, but when we say, look, these are two different things. Let's talk about X, but let's also talk about Y. So that's another thing that you might do in the context of facing fallacies of relevance. And again, the point which I think I mentioned last time, as a more general matter to ponder, is the extent to which life allows for that kind of space when you're confronted with the fallacy of relevance to think, okay, what's the argument? Is this relevant? Is it not? These are clearly examples of slow thinking, and they require structures to allow them the space to do that. By structures, I mean, again, the standard example of what I think to be a very bad structure for argument and discussion is like a TV debate. If you don't have where you have to, where you have to be quick on your feet and you have very little time to engage in discussion. So both of those are conditions that are not conducive for getting at the truth or achieving insight at some, on some kind of issue. And sometimes the intellectual self-defense might not be to try and adopt these tools and get better at them, but intellectual self-defense might just involve not entering into spaces where you won't have the time and space to have arguments of this kind. And that's true. I think that's true across the board. It applies to things like principles of charity as well. Okay, so before we go on to this next set of fallacies, the fallacies of presumption, let me ask any questions from last time, from minors, from your assignment, any Q&A we can start, and then after that we proceed to the new material. No? Okay. So let's begin then with this material. Why don't we have somebody read out that first para, how logical are you? Anyone? Hello? Oh, sorry, I didn't see. Okay, we'll go with Purvi.
How logical are you? Suppose you are pulled over for speeding. Upon walking up to your car, The officer asks you, where have you hidden the drugs? Is there a flaw in the officer's question? If so, what is it? How would you reply to the officer?
Okay, what do you think, Purvi?
Sir,
Is there a
I
flaw?
think yes, sir, because for speeding, if he's pulling over, then the question of how, where are the drugs hidden are not at all justifiable because he was just speeding over. Maybe he was in a hurry, or maybe he had to get somewhere really fast. So maybe that was the reason for his speeding, and it not necessarily be because he has hidden the drug somewhere, and that's why he's running away.
Okay, so one problem might be that the question that he's asking is inappropriate given the kind of infraction that's been committed. But anything else?
Also, I think, sir, it is like if somebody was to just walk up to me and ask this question, I'll get scared a bit because it's just a random uh, inzam. I forgot the word for it. It's just a random inzam ki you have hidden drugs somewhere.
Okay.
So it builds a bit of pressure, I think.
Okay, let's talk a little bit more about that pressure. Aryan, you wanted to comment on this?
Yes, so what Puri was saying, so it's like just an unbased accusation that you have the drugs. Where are they? So, there's that um, that assumption that you do have the drugs.
And how do you respond to that?
I guess the only way to respond is that you don't have any drugs on you if you don't have any drugs. I
So
don't think that
you reject the question. It's not like you can answer the question because the
yeah you
answer it presupposes this claim that you in fact do have drugs.
yeah
It's different from the question saying, do you have any drugs? That's like a question you can say yes or no.
yeah exactly.
But where have you hidden the drugs means that you're already starting with this assumption. I think this is what Purvi had in mind, like it builds a certain pressure. You already tipped the scales. This person believes, the conversational context in which is somehow we are assuming that, oh, I do have drugs, and now there's that question is settled, and now the only question is where they are. But there's no reason to suppose that that question is settled. Does that make sense?
Yes, sir.
Ratish, you wanted to say something, or Smita?
Yes, sir. Like it will depend on the people and the situation in which that person is. Many times it may be like fearful for that people like what is asking like if it is some police or some officer like that. Oh, what if I've done something wrong or what has happened? Or many times like people may become angry on that officer also. That can be the case.
How dare
And
you presume? Yeah, Smita, go ahead.
I think realistically, asking such a question that people don't assume like they'll be asked, they are not prepared for it. There is a like time delay in processing the question. Like there is a time of being like stupefied or something like, okay, what is this about, and then processing your answer. But at times that silence or the time delay can be misinterpreted as something that you are trying to hide something and you are trying to come up with an explanation. So realistically people might misinterpret those kind of things.
So you're kind of screwed either way. Either if you take your time to answer, then, like you say, it may seem like you are already a guilty person and trying to get out of it. But in fact, there's no way to answer it quickly. You just have to say, look, I'm sorry, it's a long thing to say that you're making an assumption in questioning me which where the assumption is false. So um, there's a famous example that you'd often find in law textbooks where the lawyer would ask the accused or whatever in a court, he'll say, when did you stop beating your wife?
Yeah, I have heard of such examples where uh, the actual aim was not to get the answer of the actual question asked, but the actual aim was to get the answer of the pre-assumed question.
That's another case where the question assumes that, look, there was a stage where you were beating your wife. And sorry, Sujit, you want to say anything?
Yeah, I wanted to say the same thing, that the other person is not asking question, but he is trying to prove the pre-assumption and considering that it is true.
So good. You can see why this set of, well, why this example at least is called a fallacy of presumption, right? You just use that term. You said pre-assumption. That's basically an assumption. You can see that it's a fallacy of, well, it's reasonable to call it a fallacy of presumption. The person you're arguing with is making a presumption that you actually want to reject. Let's actually maybe just turn it. Maybe useful just to look at this particular example to what Hurley has to say. This is an example of where is it gone here? A complex question. And why don't we have somebody read this? This first paragraph. I can't remember who was on that list. I think Aryan had volunteered. No, Purvi will. Actually, Purvi, why don't you continue?
The fallacy of complex question is committed when two or more questions are asked in the guise of a single question, and a single answer is then given to both of them. Every complex question presumes that the existence of a certain condition. When the respondent's answer is added to the complex question, an argument emerges that establishes the presumed condition. Thus, although not an argument as such, a complex question involves an implicit argument. This argument is usually intended to trap the respondent into acknowledging something that he or she might otherwise not want to acknowledge.
Yeah, good example. You can see have you stopped cheating in your exams? We've seen a bunch of those kinds of examples. So yeah, so in a complex question, you presuppose the existence of some condition. You don't explicitly state it, right? The condition being, let's say, that you were beating your wife or that you do have drugs. And if the condition holds, then well, then the question makes sense. But the result that the person asking the question already already follows it. And if that condition was stated explicitly, then you would just reject it. You'd say, no, I didn't beat my wife, or I've never beaten my wife. I don't have drugs in my car. You can see, in fact, some of those discussions we had on framing are relevant. Right? If you say, I'm trying to say, look, why are you friends with anti-nationals? You might think that's an example of, the term anti-national carries with a certain kind of presumption, and rather than Umar Khalid's bail hearing is happening right now. Somebody said, look, you're a friend of Umar Khalid. Why are you a friend of an anti-national? And you might say, look, hey, he's a really nice guy. But if you say that, then you've already bought into this presumption that he is anti-national. Do people know who I'm talking about?
Yes, sir. I guess he was a student of JNU.
Yeah, he was in JNU a few years back, and anyway, it's a long and sordid sort of saga. But you get my point that the what to do or the problem that arises with the complex question is similar with the problem that arises with certain kinds of framing, where you have to kind of push back against the framing or push back against the assumptions behind the question, rather than try and answer in the terms of the frame that's given to you, or answer in terms of the conditions that the question assumes. And again, you can see that the ability to push back in that way, it may be harder in some circumstances than in others. For instance, when you're faced with somebody in authority like a policeman or a lawyer, it might be easy to get tripped up. So that's that's one example of the kind of fallacy that Hurley is interested in. And in general, for these fallacies, the arguments in question are valid, and the premises are in fact related to the conclusion. So these are not fallacies like fallacies of relevance. The real issue is with the premises themselves and with the presentation of the premises, and whether they present a complete picture of what's going on, or whether they're framed in ways that will get you to assent to them when you shouldn't. That's the kind of domain in which these fallacies exist. Sorry, I'm clutching my head because I have a bit of a headache. And for our purposes, Hurley has a kind of a long list, but we're interested in really 4 types. One is called begging the question, which is the first one that Hurley talks about. Then we have the complex question that we've just looked at. We have false dichotomy and suppressed evidence. I'm just going to put these out there as the 4 that you should have some familiarity with. And again, the point of the labels is just to make it easy to identify and to figure out how to respond to. So if you have the templates in your head, then you may be less flustered in particular conversational contexts when these tactics are used. That's at least the aim. Now I don't know if that's actually work. Okay, so we've already looked at number 2, the complex question. Let's look at number 1, begging the question. I'm going to go back to begging the question. There's a even for Hurley, the term begging the question is a kind of very standard term that ends up being used in many different kinds of ways, and we didn't go into the range of ways that is, but we'll focus on the first 2 that Hurley describes. Why don't we have Aryan start reading this para that starts the fallacy of begging the question.
All right. The fallacy of begging the question is committed whenever the arguer creates the illusion that inadequate premises provide adequate support for the conclusion by leaving out a possibly false or shaky key premise, by restating a possibly false premise as the conclusion, or by reasoning circularly. The Latin name for this fallacy, petitio principii, means request for the source. The actual source of support for the conclusion is not apparent, and so the argument is said to beg the question. After reading or hearing the argument, the observer is inclined to ask, but how do you know X, where X is the needed support?
Okay. Take a look at the examples at the bottom of the page and think about, as you look at them, what the X is that provides that requires the needed support. So what I'd like you to do is just take a look at that, and I'm just going to step away for 1 second and come back. But in the meantime, you can just go through those examples. Just go through the examples and think for yourself, what is the what's the particular bit that's missing in the arguments in question. Okay, I am back. Let's go back to these examples. So Aryan, why don't you go? Let's go through a couple of these, and you tell me what is the X or what's the problem.
All right. Should I just read all 4 examples?
Oh, and just after each example, just let's have a discussion of the example.
Oh. So the first example reads, murder is morally wrong. This being the case, it follows that abortion is morally wrong.
So what's the X?
Here the X would be that like, why is abortion like equal to murder, basically?
That's right. That's the bridge, right? That's the bridge that's missing, but really taken for granted by the argument. You can see again why this is a fallacy, but why it might be called a fallacy of presumption, because it's the key bit that is that's required for the conclusion to follow from the premises, but which the argument itself doesn't present. It looks like when you look at this statement, it looks like, look, murder is morally wrong, almost as though that's the premise that maybe is sort of controversial. And I said, yeah, it follows by logic that abortion is morally wrong, but we haven't made that connection that abortion is murder. Okay, next.
The next one. We know that humans are intended to eat lots of fruit because the human hand and arm are perfectly suited for picking fruit from a tree.
What's the problem here?
Yeah, I couldn't think of a problem for this. Like, not exactly. It doesn't make sense, but I don't see the exact issue.
Anyone? What we have to look for is this shaky key premise. That's not there. I agree, it's not a straightforward example.
Sir, here, what is the meaning of perfectly suited for picking fruit from a tree? Is it the case like only humans have the hands which is perfectly fitted for picking the fruit from tree? Other animals also have the hands they can pick the fruits from tree. So it's just that, like, what's the meaning here?
But will that make a difference in the argument? After all, it's consistent to say that humans are intended to eat lots of fruit, but other animals are also intended to eat lots of fruit. Monkeys are also. And I agree, that's a question that's not clear, but it's not clear to me that that's the issue.
Sir, so
yeah. Let's have hands up because there's so many people. So we'll go with Aryan, Piyush, and Sumedha.
So not exactly like pointing out the issue, but by the same logic, I could say that human hands, fit perfectly around the neck of another human. So humans are intended to kill other people. I mean, by the same logic, which obviously is wrong. But yeah, it's not. I'm
It's,
not pointing out the issue, but yeah.
well, that's a nice catch. So how could you turn that into a key premise? Okay, we'll go with Aryan, you have a thought, otherwise we'll go with Piyush and Sumedha.
Yeah, we can probably move ahead.
So, sir, it is kind of saying that what we can handpick is what we should eat. So, like the function of uh, our hand has many functions. So, it's just saying that handpicking is one of them. So, handpicking should decide what we eat. So, it's
No, it's not saying that, by the way. It's saying that we are intended to eat. Maybe we shouldn't eat what we're intended to eat. That's another matter.
Uh,
Yeah, Sumedha.
so maybe the bridge question is: are we intended to eat everything that we can pick perfectly from our hand, or whatever falls in the grip of our hand? That might be the bridge question.
Yeah, I think we could either make that the missing the shaky key premise, or I like the, in a way Aryan pointed towards the generalization of that. Right? Isn't the case that whenever we'd have to phrase it in a kind of um, uh, fairly abstract kind of way, but you say, look, let me try and type it out. Is it the case that whenever x is perfectly fit for y, x was intended for y? Well, if that premise was true, then this would follow. But as Aryan's example, which where where x is the human hand and arm and Y is strangling somebody, shows that this premise is false. The answer to this question uh, is no. Does that make sense?
Yes, sir.
Okay, let's go for Aryan. What about the next?
Sure. So it's obvious that the poor in the country should be given handouts from the government. After all, these people earn less than the average citizen. Should I go ahead and
Sure. So you can try your hand. What's the missing premise here?
so this still doesn't explain why handouts should be given. Um, so the conclusion explains why the people are poor, but it doesn't explain why handouts should be given specifically.
So the missing key premise is that people who earn less than the average citizen should be given handouts, right? If you could establish that premise, then you'd get the conclusion.
Yeah, I guess so.
By the way, if you remember in one of our readings earlier on, I think it was the reading by Robert Carroll, he said, right, that watch out for words like obvious and even no. These are words that people
Assuring
use to kind of, sorry?
Assuring expressions, right?
Assuring expressions. Right? These are terms that can be used to kind of just smoothen over that gap in the reasoning. And even you can tell, right? Like when you read this, like we're in a place that's not a high pressure kind of context, but it takes a moment to think about what the problem is.
Yeah.
Okay, let's do the last one.
All right, so the last one. Clearly, terminally ill patients have a right to doctor-assisted suicide. After all, many of these people are unable to commit suicide by themselves. So, the question here should be that why should terminally ill patients be able to commit suicide in the first place?
Right. Why should they have a right to doctors to suicides per se? Yeah, Piyush.
Sir, I think the question here should be that how do we know that they want to commit suicide? Like in the question, it's kind of assuming itself that terminally ill patients want to commit suicide either by themselves or by doctor-assisted suicide. But how do we know that they want to?
So I have two thoughts. I mean, you're right that this argument doesn't talk about whether they want to or not. But two things, Piyush. One is we're already dealing with an argument that has a conclusion. So, in a way, our assessment of the argument is bound by the particular conclusion that's presented to us. I think what you're presenting to us is, look, there's a further consideration. Maybe we don't even know. Maybe there's no point in having such a right. After all, I can have a right to something without wanting that thing, right? I can have I have a right to vote even though I may not want to vote. So I don't think that the issue of whether we want to, whether terminally people want to have doctor-assisted suicides is relevant to this particular case. Does that make sense?
Yes, sir, yes.
Okay, so we've done one set of, a subset of these.
Sir?
Yeah, begging the question, tell me.
Yes, sir. Can you explain then what was the problem with the last one?
With this one?
Yes, sir.
Yeah. So well, maybe I'll just ask somebody else to explain it. And Aryan already did one round, but anyone else? Want to just restate the problem in a way that makes sense for Piyush?
Can I give it a go? Maybe the question is why does their inability to do something, like that something is committing suicide, but why does their inability to do something justify their like right to be assisted in that activity?
Yeah, that seems correct. That's at least one way of framing the question that requires that kind of bridge. I think it sounds a little bit more complicated than it needs to be, in the sense that I think the simpler shaky key premise might be patients have a right. Patients who want terminally ill patients who want to kill themselves should be able to do so. And it should be prevented.
Understand. At first, I didn't get it. It was kind of like an emotionally appealing sentence, but critically thinking, it's like she stated that their inability to commit suicide doesn't like give them the right to take help of someone.
Yeah, because maybe nobody should have the right to commit suicide, even assisted or not. And again, you can see, look, that these are questions. Sorry, Anish, did you want to come in on this? I saw you.
No, sir.
I mean, it was just a random thought when I heard Sumedha saying that. I mean, I could rephrase the same as that kids cannot commit theft, so adults should assist them doing this. So this can be a.
And that you guys are, both you and Aryan, into this thing of let's find parallels that show that the reasoning is problematic. It's a nice parallel. Yes, Jeet.
Yes, in that way, a lot of parallels can be found that if the terminally ill patient cannot do suicide by himself, so he owes, so others owes him the right to do so. So yeah, so we can find some examples that way. That if I cannot do something, then I shall have a right to do with someone's assistance.
That's it. So that's another way of, that's even the, it's like the most general formulation of this is it the case when X is unable to do Y, they have a right to if that premise was true, then the argument would follow. But you see, look, in this kind of abstract way, that premise clearly is false. So make sense the structure of these kinds of cases?
Yes, sir.
Okay, so let's then go to the other set of this this kind of argument. I mean, this kind of fallacy, and let's have somebody else read this section out. I can't recall who had their hands up. Was it Sumedha in the queue? Or Ratnesh, was it? I can't remember.
Yes, sir.
Okay, Sumedha, so go for it.
So
from here, the second form
Okay.
of petitio principii.
Second form of petitio principii occurs when the conclusion of an argument merely states a possibly false premise in slightly different language. In such an argument, the premise supports the conclusion, and the conclusion tends to reinforce the premise. Examples: capital punishment is justified for the crimes of murder and kidnapping because it is quite legitimate and appropriate that someone be put to death for having committed such a hateful and inhuman acts.
So just pause there. So what's the problem with this argument?
Well, that's just a reframing. Like, the actual conclusion should be like it like begs the question that whether it's a legitimate, whether it is actually legitimate and appropriate that someone should be put to death for having committed such hateful and inhuman acts, and the conclusion that capital punishment is justified is the same thing.
Well, what's wrong? What's wrong with it being the same thing?
Because,
by the way, you should ask one question to ask is it a valid argument?
well, if yes, it is a valid argument, because if the premise is true, then the conclusion is true because they mean the same thing.
They're the same thing. Good. So it's a valid argument. So it's a nice example of a valid argument that has some kind of problem with it.
But the problem here is if the premise is true and the truth of the premise is unknown, like there is no discussion whether the thing they are considered premise is true or not.
So one way of one way in which people talk about this kind of case is, does the premise provide any kind of independent support for the and then maybe you need to mute yourself. Can mute you for yourself for you.
Sir,
Yeah.
I think that it's excluding that those cases where the murder or kidnapping was the murder was done in self, like to protect yourself, maybe. So maybe in that case, the capital punishment is not the right way to go about it.
So good. It may be that the conclusion is false. If you just take this, and this is the conclusion of the argument is capital punishment is justified for the crimes of murder and kidnapping. But you can imagine, I think what you're pointing out to is, look, maybe that's just a false conclusion because there might be cases of murder and kidnapping that are justified because you give the example of self-defense.
So, but in those cases, the premise would be a bit false too, right? Like committing such hateful and inhuman acts, then self-defense is not a hateful or inhuman act. So
good. So that would be the response, is to say that that kind of argument, that kind of case would not be covered by the premise. Aditya, you have your hand up.
So, like, I would say that in this argument, there are essentially two premises. One is that murder and kidnapping are always hateful and inhuman acts.
Yeah.
Which is an implicit premise, like which they don't say but they assume it. And the other is that you should kill somebody for doing inhuman and hateful acts. So the problem with the second premise is that's what we are arguing about, and it does not provide any more arguments for it than just restating the premise. And the first is that
go ahead.
And the first is like they said that self-defense could be, maybe we do not consider self-defense a hateful and inhuman act, even if it does involve killing somebody.
So this is a nice case where there's one issue about, look, the truth of the premises. We've already established the argument is valid, assuming that justified means the same thing as legitimate and appropriate. So we know it's valid. We may have a doubt about whether the premises are true, but the interesting kind of problem with this is really centers around the because. Right? The premise is not providing a relationship of evidence or justification for the conclusion, because they're just saying the same thing. And you can see, for instance, if I said, well, why should I believe that? Look, it's if I say it's raining outside, and somebody says, well, what's your argument for that conclusion? And I say, hey, my premise is it's raining outside, and if it's raining outside, then it's raining outside, so it's raining outside. You can see, look, it's totally empty. You don't add anything. You've not added anything to the premise to give you the conclusion, and so it doesn't provide what one might call independent justification for the conclusion. Sumedha, let's take the next example.
Anyone who preaches revolution has a vision of the future, for the simple reason that if a person has no vision of the future, he could not possibly preach revolution.
So what's the problem there?
I would say that this argument is almost completely, like, it does not say anything at all. Like, what does it mean to have or not have a vision of the future? Like, it is extremely underspecified, this argument.
But is that the problem? Is that the primary problem, that this phrase
I think that it is like a more basic problem. It is not the concepts it tries to use are not well defined at all in the way it tries to use them.
Well, the premise is the contrapositive of the conclusion.
The contrapositive of a statement is logically equivalent to the statement, right?
Yeah, logically equivalent, right.
And so people understand that, right? Contrapositives, like maths and things.
But I'm not really sure that if you like restating an argument in terms of its contrapositive can be helpful, because it sometimes clarifies some of the parts of the argument, and we can easily check its truth value. So I'm not sure, like, the argument that this argument simply restates it in terms of its contrapositive is actually a weak point of this argument.
So a good point. How would you respond to that, Sumedha, or anyone else?
I think I agree. Like, we do that while checking an argument, we like reframe it in terms of contrapositive and check those contrapositive.
So that's something that we do, and it's quite helpful, as Aditya has pointed out. Aryan.
So sorry about the earlier thing. Also, in this case, it could be helpful in to rephrase it in its contrapositive, but either way you have to prove one of the two statements. You can't say that the contrapositive proves the actual statement is like logical fact. That doesn't That isn't like a valid premise for the conclusion. At least you have to provide premises for that contrapositive for it to make sense.
Right. So, and this will be my response as well, is that it's true that often when you're testing an argument or testing a conclusion, it makes sense to test its contrapositive. But that's quite different from saying that something is in doing that, we're not using the initial statement as a premise in the proof of the contrapositive. That's the problem, right?
I don't think this works because sometimes the contrapositive is really simpler than the original statement. Like in this particular case, like if I remove the problems I have with vision of the future and revolution in this case, so like let's say a person who does not have a idea of the future cannot say anything about how the future should be. This is almost obviously true.
Okay.
Like I think that this is a basic, like if you don't understand the future, you cannot say how the future should change, and that can help us also see the truth value of its contrapositive. I'm not sure that simply restating it in the contrapositive is not helpful in this case.
I mean, it's helpful, but it is like does not logically supports the actual conclusion.
It does, right? Like for example, I can't think something on the fly, but like the second statement does logically support the first statement. It's just that, and the second statement is logically simpler than the first statement to check. So the second statement does provide a logical argument for the first statement, and it is useful to reframe it in that sense.
Well, the argument that you use for the second statement can be directly used for the first statement also.
What argument are you using for the second statement? That
okay, hang on. Ratnesh wants to come in. Ratnesh, go ahead. Go ahead.
Yes, sir. Sir, the fact here is that like when we are giving this counter positive statement, so when it will be like when we are sure that it is true, then only we can use it as a tool for proving or disproving the first statement. But here what he is saying is he could not be, could be, maybe he can be, maybe it is possible and maybe it is not possible. So here the statement is not like 100% correct. What is being stated in the counter positive here?
I see. So you're denying that. Essentially, you're denying that these are actually contrapositives. You're denying that this is anyone who preaches revolution has a vision for the future. You're denying that that's a contrapositive of if a person has no vision of the future, he could not possibly preach revolution. Is that right?
I would say that they are contrapositive. Like probably you could also interpret it in different ways, but the interpretation I am seeing does say that they are contrapositive. Like could not there does not mean a possibility, but a very sharp statement like it is impossible.
Okay, yeah, I would agree with that. So this is an interesting thing. I would disagree, and I would leave you to think about this some more. But just to specify, I mean, in another way, what I think Aryan and Sumedha and I are saying. So I agree entirely that sometimes if the question is, if you have a conclusion all A's are B's, sometimes it's easier to look into the test the conclusion all not B's are not A's, but no, Aditya's the main point that Aditya is making, that sometimes if you're trying to assess the truth of this claim, it's better to look at the truth of this claim, and we can be sure that because they're contrapositives, if this statement is correct, then so will this, right? They are logically equivalent.
So I guess we discussed the exact same example with the previous example, like the capital punishment, and my response to that self-defense was that they are not considered hateful and inhuman acts. Like these two statements are the same thing, but it is easier for me to define something, whether it's like it's appropriate or not, in terms of the second statement better.
I'm not sure I agree with that framing of it, but let me just finish what I was trying to say. That this is what Aditya was trying to say, that look, if you have a conclusion like this, often it's better, it's like clearer, easier to see whether the contrapositive is true. But the difference is we're talking about arguments. That's what we're talking about, statements, um, an evidentiary or a justificatory relationship between premises and conclusions. And so our question is a bit different. Our question is not the question of directly testing that particular statement, but of evaluating an argument. Right? And the argument in question is something like this. Let's say the premise is all A's. I'm going to write it down as A's are B's, and conclusion, therefore, all not B's are not A's. And the reason it's begging the question is, if somebody challenges you for this, look, I'm claiming that all B's are not A's, and then you need to, and you were asked to say, look, why do you think that? What's the basis on which you say that? If all you say is, if all you offer as a premise is all A's are B's, that's not providing any independent evidence. This is, I think, what Aryan's point is. Look, this could be helpful as long as you had some further evidence for this claim that all A's are B's. But by itself, this claim doesn't provide any independent evidence for this claim. Okay, Aditya.
So I was just saying that I think I agree with you. Like the second statement could also be false. Like it's not very obviously true. If you think about it, like somebody could easily have no vision of future but still preach revolution. So there's this sense in which the second statement is not actually easier, even if it looks easier. And I think that's a thing to be careful of here.
True. So that's one more thing to be careful of. Just one thing to keep in mind. This is maybe a more abstract point. It's interesting in many kinds of arguments. There's a kind of, you can argue, you can respond to arguments kind of at a semantic level, where you're asking the kind of question that Ratnesh was asking, or Aditya just asked about, look, is it really true that you can't preach revolution unless you have a vision of the future? And you need to understand these terms. And the other is like at a syntactic or a logical level. So when Arnesh gave that example of theft, or Aryan gave the example, and I can't remember what the example is that he gave, where you abstract it out. Or I give these kind of missing premises in terms of X and Y. There you're just examining the pattern of the reasoning, and you're showing that when you frame it so abstractly, you can tell the reasoning is flawed. So these are very different kinds of ways in which you can evaluate arguments. They're both important and useful. Okay, so I hope that that this discussion is clear. Some fun pushback, and the takeaway here again is that really this statement, by repeating the same thing in different language, the arguer creates the illusion that independent evidence is being presented in support of the conclusion. So that's really that word independent. What's key here? And in general, in an argumentative context, somebody offers me a conclusion and I say, look, I don't agree with that. Give me a reason to believe it. If you just restated it, the conclusion as a premise, well, I'm going to disagree with that also, right? Like I want some independent evidence. Yeah, Piyush.
Sharf, I wanted to ask first why the first example was a valid argument, and secondly, what can we say about the validity of the second example?
Okay, I'll throw it back to Sumedha was reading these examples. So why is the first example a valid example? And I can see that Aditya also wants to jump into this.
Like the thing is that in the first example, if the premise is true, then the conclusion will be true. But the thing is that we have not you have not satisfied that the premise is already true. The premise is sort of a simple restatement of the conclusion. So while the premise does imply the conclusion, or at least points towards it, the very thing the argument is based on is the premise, like whether it is legitimate and appropriate to that somebody should be put to death for committing hateful and inhuman act. This is what we are arguing about, and that's why it is incorrect to use this argument. But because this premise just supports the conclusion, it is logically correct.
So remember what validity is, Piyush. Validity just means that if the premise is true, then it's not possible for the conclusion to be false. Right? That's just the definition of validity. And so in this case, if the premise and the conclusion, they're saying the same thing. That if this statement.
Sir, in such cases, when the premises and the conclusions are like slightly restated, so they'll always be valid arguments.
That's it. If you establish that the premise and conclusion are basically saying the same thing, then you have got, by default, you've got a valid argument. And sometimes the term that's used to describe this, which you may have come across, I don't know, in maths also, is a tautology. Look, you're not saying anything new. You're just telling me what I. Yeah. Does that make sense? So yeah, whenever you have a situation of this kind, where the premise and the conclusion are saying the same thing, then you've got then it's not possible for the premise to be true and the conclusion to be false. That would be a contradiction. So that's why it's a valid argument. Does that make sense?
Yes, sir.
Okay. Let's go on then. I'm going to skip this third kind of begging the question. Maybe this is a useful thing to just note. So Sumedha, why don't you carry on reading from here? In all cases of begging the question.
In all cases of begging the question, the arguer uses some linguistic device to create the illusion that inadequate premises provide adequate support for a conclusion. Without such an illusion, the fallacy is not committed. Thus, the following arguments commit no fallacy. No dogs are cats, therefore no cats are dogs. London is in England and Paris is in France. Therefore, Paris is in France and London is in England. In both of these examples,
yeah, no, go ahead.
The premise amounts to little more than a restatement of the conclusion. Yet both arguments are sound because they are valid and have true premises. No fallacy is committed because no illusion is created to make inadequate premises appear as adequate. We will study arguments of this sort in chapter 4 and 7.
Okay, so you can just pause that. So again, the key notion here is the adequacy or the idea of independent support. That's the thing to focus on in cases of begging the question. It's kind of hard to imagine why anyone would make this claim. Maybe they're explaining what a contrapositive is, but it doesn't. This doesn't trick you into thinking that there's some reason, some independent reason to support the truth of this claim. Okay, so let me turn now to two more fallacies. I didn't realize we've taken up a fair amount of time on these two. We already looked at complex question. Let's take a look at the false dichotomy. So I think in that queue of people who want to speak, I think Ratnesh was next, unless I got that wrong. So Ratnesh, do you want to go ahead or did you already read? I've forgotten.
Yes, sir. Yes, I can go ahead.
Okay.
So yeah. So the policy of false dichotomy is committed when a disjunctive either or a premise presents two unlikely alternatives as if they were the only one available, and the arguer then eliminates the undesirable alternative, leaving the desirable one as the conclusion. Such an argument is clearly valid, but since the disjunctive premise is false, or at least probably false, the argument is typically unsound. The policy is often committed by children when arguing with their parents, by advisors, and by adults gradually. Here are three examples. Either you let me attend the uh, pink concert, or I will be miserable for the rest of my life. I know you don't want me to be miserable for the rest of my life, so it follows that you will let me attend the concert.
Okay, so what do you think? What's the issue there? By the way, these are sometimes called the either or fallacy. So what's the problem with this statement, with this argument?
There is a probability that even if I don't attend the concert, I won't be miserable for the rest of my life.
That's right. The point is that this is not an exhaustive list of possibilities. And that's why it's called a false dichotomy. What's a dichotomy is when you have two options. A false dichotomy is when you're saying, look, I only have two options, or there are only two options. And the point is to say, look, no, those are not the only two options. If you only had two options, then yes, if this option didn't work out, then this is going to happen. But in a context where, well, it may well be in many of these cases that there are more than two options, and in the swing of the argument, one may not recognize that. Ratnesh, why don't you carry on? Let's take another couple of examples.
Yes, sir. So either you use ultra good deodorant, or you risk the chance of perspiration odor. Surely you don't want to risk the chance of perspiration odor. Therefore, you want to use ultra god deodorant.
Okay, so Ratnesh, what's the issue here?
Yes, so sir, I think the issue is there with like the person can use other kinds of deodorant also, but the argument is saying like you have to use only this.
So yeah, so maybe
it is advertising a brand, I think.
Yeah, first of all, one problem is that it's not it's not including other possible deodorants, and maybe deodorants aren't essential for preventing perspiration odor or whatever. But again, you see, the issue is with that premise. Yeah, Aditya.
I would say that because it says you risk the chance, it does not matter if it including all or more deodorants or not, because you'll always risk a chance of odor with them. We can.
Well,
But I think
Yeah.
I'll say that the incorrect thing is that it implies that Ultra Guard deodorant will remove the chance of odor, which it will not.
Oh, interesting. Um, so you think this sounds to be more like a false implication or something like that, and then you think,
So I think all false dichotomies have a false implication. Like the first one had a false implication that if I don't attend the concert, I'll be miserable for the rest of my life.
so I think that may be true, but I think the
I mean, the either or conditions for false dichotomy, they don't need to be like for false dichotomy, they are not exhaustive. But what Aditya is saying that they aren't exclusive, mutually exclusive either.
nice. That's a nice way of putting it. So look, arguments can have multiple problems with them, and you may have just found an example of that. But the particular problem this example was supposed to illustrate was more on this issue of the you know, how exhaustive is the premise that's the source of support for the conclusion. Ratish, do you want to try? Should we do this, the third?
Yes, sir. So either we adopt a one world government or regional wars will continue forever. We certainly cannot tolerate constant war. Therefore, we must adopt a one world government.
It's an interesting moment to be discussing this argument, the war in Ukraine.
Yes, sir.
So what's the problem here?
So like the problem is there, like we cannot certainly say that even there is a one world government, so there can't be regional wars. There may be wars in a one world, like even if there is a one world government.
So that sounds like again like Aditya's example, and it sounds like a case where the issue is that these things are not exclusive, but from the point of view of a false dichotomy, are there other options? Are these the only two options available? Are these the only two possibilities? Yeah, Sujit.
Yes, sir. The simplest example would be the European Union, where they don't have a single government, but every country is living peacefully and with coordinating each other, having no wars or something like that.
I'm
Nice.
not
So you
sure.
could say, yeah, go ahead, Aditya.
I'm not sure if that's an argument because the European Union is arguably a government on Europe. Like it has a legislature and a judiciary. Like it is very much a government on Europe. Even if its powers are not very large, it is a government on Europe.
So, good.
Yeah,
Maybe it's
I
a
would
debatable
say,
question, but go ahead, Sujit.
yeah, I would say that is more of a coordination between them.
Like
To,
the people in the legislature are directly elected by the people of Europe. In the
So
European
there are
Union.
possibly debates. I agree with you. There are debates about whether one should count the European Union as a government. But I would be inclined in this case to agree with Sujit that look, part of this problem, I guess, what this discussion between Aditya and Sujit is showing is that maybe the term government itself has a certain ambiguity, or maybe it's underspecified. We need to understand. Look, what kind of government are we talking about? Whereas, but that's maybe that's an additional problem with it. We need to specify that a little bit more clearly. But insofar as we are interested in whether there is a false dichotomy, then I would think of Sujit's example as a nice one, on the assumption that the European Union is not a government in the way that the author has in mind. You could say, look, either we adopt a one world government or we adopt I don't know, a federation, or we adopt an agreement amongst all sovereign nations to not invade each other. After all, the United Nations is supposed to be, you know, it's failed in its promise to contain aggression between nations. But you could think of there may be many options other than the option of a one world government, whatever that means. And maybe there's a continuum of things that could be counted as a government. I mean, in the American Republican Party, or the American right wing, has always had a real suspicion for the UN. I think the British right wing, I mean, the Tories have had a real suspicion for the European Union, basically on these grounds, on grounds of sovereignty, that um, uh, these larger entities, the UN or the European Union, are preventing the proper exercise of my sovereignty. I remember when I went to the US in the mid 90s, I was so shocked. Like, at that time, at least, the UN was a big deal. And, it had some kind of pride that it's the in line with the ideals of whatever non-alignment and Nehruvian internationalism. So they always very shocked at this idea that people could criticize the UN. But anyway, that's neither here nor there. The point is that so the reason I brought it up was that, in a way, the American right wing and the British right wing that has advocated for leaving the European Union and done so successfully, would cast things like the UN as a one world government thing. Look, we don't want to be ruled by these people in the UN. We are quite happy with our own government. Thank you very much. So in the case of the false dichotomy, again, you'll see the arguments are valid. And the question just to ask yourself is, well, are these the only options? Again, something that it's just worth doing in lots of different contexts, not just in critical thinking context, but this idea of the either or fallacy. You'll see it if you ever go to a counselor, for instance. It's a standard part of the toolkit of what's called I don't know if you know, or if you've ever gone to a counselor, what's called cognitive behavioral therapy. But people say, look, don't fall into the trap of either or thinking, or sometimes black and white thinking, where it's either one thing or the other thing. Either I'll get into IIT or I'll be miserable for the rest of my life. Which maybe maybe your friends who didn't get into IIT had that thought at some point, who took the JEE along you guys. Of course, that's also a case where, anyway. So Ratnesh, you wanted to say anything?
Not sir, but I have a question. Like, let's say the UN is not so powerful. That's why it is not able to manage all the members of it to restrict them to war with each other. But let's say suppose that we have had an UN and which is powerful enough, let's say the power of United States and China, both the sum of both of this power is there in there is a world government, and it have that amount of power, and it can control anything. But then also can we consider that that will be good for the world? Take for example, even in China or in any other country, why country separates divides in two parts, or in many parts, people are not happy, then only they are dividing from one another. So we
Good.
can't say that even if there is a government that is good for the world.
So it sounds like the thing that you're questioning is whether this is a bad thing. Regional wars continuing forever. Maybe some wars are necessary, and maybe they're important, or maybe the cost of suppressing all wars is going to be too high. So there are many other questions one can ask of that argument. And it's interesting. It's interesting. I hadn't thought about this when I was preparing for class, but maybe Hurley made the mistake of choosing examples that could illustrate lots of different sorts of problems. And you've seen problems of vagueness or problems of false implication. But the particular thing to watch out for, at least that this example, this category of false dichotomy, is the watching out for the limited options that are presented to you. So I guess we're out of time. So I won't go over myself this example of suppressed evidence, but you can take a look at it. It's in a way something that's already been covered by that reading by Robert Carroll, and we'll see a little bit of it in the reading by Richard Feynman that's assigned for Monday. So I will take my leave of you guys. I'll see some of you tomorrow at the tutorial. All the best for your minor assignments. See you. Thank you. This was fun. I really like the extent of argument and discussion that we got going here. Bye.
Bye,
Thank you,
sir.
sir.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you, sir.
Thanks.
Yes, sir.